So, hi everyone, Paul Krugman again. This is an activation of the emergency trade policy analysis system. We're recording this on Thursday after Wednesday night, rather abruptly, everything we thought was happening on US and global trade policy suddenly stopped being true. It was a wild announcement from I want to say the International Trade Court, and which I wasn't even paying attention to. And I'm bringing back Joey Politano, who's been following trade stuff very closely and following these latest events, and is probably being driven completely crazy by the fact that all the it keeps on happening that he puts in days of work that suddenly become irrelevant because everything has changed. But anyway, um, I could try to summarize what happened, but why don't you tell us, Joy, what just happened to everything we thought we knew about where tariffs were going?
Yeah, and thanks for having me back on again. I'll say in our first conversation, one of the things I mentioned was um, that Trump can do these sort of tariffs unilaterally because he can declare an emergency basically and then activate a bunch of emergency powers and use those to impose tariffs. And I distinctly remember in the conversation we had that I said, I think the courts have got this wrong generally. They give too much deference to the president about what an emergency is, and in particular, Trump had declared fentanyl an emergency, and that's why we're doing tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China. And then he declared the existence of the trade deficit an emergency. And what this court ruling was basically doing was saying that authority you use, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, is supposed to be activated for real emergencies. If you look back on the uses, it's wars, famines, trade blockages, sanctions against people who've done horrible crimes. This is not a real emergency, and in particular, the remedy that you're using doesn't make sense. So the Trump lawyers argued in court, like, "Hey, fentanyl is a real thing. It kills people. It's an emergency." And the court basically said, "That's true. Fentanyl is a bad thing, but the fact that you put a 25% tariff on steel that comes from China or like toys is not actually affecting the fentanyl trade at all. It's completely unrelated. And so you can't use this economic emergency power to put tariffs on China."
Yeah, I mean, the way I always thought of it is, I mean, we have a system. U.S. trade tariffs are generally set in negotiations with other countries, or have historically, and so we have a set of tariffs, and they're not up for continuous revotes by Congress. Congress kind of, says yes or no on a trade agreement, but that system is a little too rigid, and so we have rules that allow the president some discretion to do things when their pressure is too great. Um, and the usual ones until the past have been these, there's this, if it's numbers, it's not an alphabet soup, but there's a numbers soup. There's a sections 201, 232, 301. And mostly what Trump did in term one was 232s, which are national security, which were themselves fairly absurd, but were also relatively limited. But then he invoked this other thing, which is this International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Um, and I guess we all assumed that um, the relevant people would just roll over as they have on everything else. But it turns out that the International Trade Court is not the same as the people who say up or down on these more limited kinds of tariffs. So yeah, what you want to tell me? I mean, I've just been going back to look at the 232s, and it's a very, very different process, right?
Right. And so I think it's actually good to backtrack to the first term, like you said. In Trump's first term, he does two sets of tariffs. Section 232 of the Trade Act of 1974 basically says the president has the authority to restrict imports based on national security, if they threaten national security. But the key thing is there you have to do a lot of homework. You have to come in with a 100-page long report that says imports of steel are a threat to national security, and here's the reasons why. And critically, people could go to court and say, this report, we
Right.
disagree with it. We think that your reasoning is wrong, and blah blah blah. So you have like a dispute mechanism there. And then there was a second side, Section 301, which same act, but the basic logic there was a specific country is doing something unfair. So Section
Yeah.
232, that's imports of steel are threatening national security. Section 301 is China is doing something that we deem unfair. And most of Trump's tariffs in his first term were Section 301, the China stuff. And that escalated from a few billion to over 300 billion by the time he was done of tariffs on China. But that also requires a lot of homework. You got to
So
write. There's a really giant report that they say, here's all the things that we think China is doing unfairly, and China gets to come in and say, no, we're doing that fairly, and there's a whole process you got to go through, and the process is very deferential to the president. Very, like, that's the key thing that I would get across here. The Section 232, if you read them, like, I happen to think those arguments are really bad. But they're arguments, and the courts are like, yeah, it's defensibly, you put text to page here, and we can see what your logic is. We're going to give you some latitude here. This was like, you didn't do any homework. This is so far out of
this
left
meaning
field that
the recent tariffs, but yeah,
right, the recent tariffs,
I mean the
IEEPA tariffs.
232 is a there's a flow chart. The Secretary of Commerce launches an investigation. The investigation produces a report. The report's conclusions are there's a hearing, and then the president decides whether to accept the recommendations, most of which pretty much went by the wayside. It was kind of, this is the Trump administration. If Trump wants your opinion, he'll tell you what it is. But it was still at least a little bit of a process, and there were some absurdities in there. Aluminum from Canada is a national security threat. But then that wasn't enough. So they went to this uh, IEEPA, alphabet, but there's International Economic uh, Emergency Powers Act,
Emergency powers,
um,
yeah.
which basically, if successfully invoked, gives him the ability to do practically anything. Right? That's what happened here.
Kind of, and part of the court's ruling here was that IEPA, the Economic Emergency Powers Act, has only ever been invoked to do smaller things. So when the war with Libya was starting, you invoked IEPA, or like against Russia, we invoked it, and the point is to allow the president authority to respond to a national conflict, national emergency with some sort of restrictions, but never tariffs, and never tariffs this broad. Um, and so this was kind of a test, like what is the actual authority we can use here? And the court partly ruled that tariffs are supposed to be more the lane of Congress. They didn't put an exact cap on the authority. They said you have some of it, and they also said there are other things that you're supposed to do for tariffs. So I'm trying to write this down because you're right. It's like a number soup to try to keep up with this. But Section 122 is an example here. So in the second IEPA um, declaration, they said the trade deficit is an emergency. That's why we're putting tariffs on the European Union. The trade deficit is an emergency. And the court basically said, hey, there's already an authority, Section 122, for balance of payments crises. That's what you're supposed to use. And that authority is restricted. You can only go up to 15% tariffs. You have to do it on every country equally. And critically, it goes to Congress if you want to do it for more than 150 days. So you have to get congressional approval if you want to do it for more than 4 or 5 months. So go use that. And the IEPA doesn't give you this authority because it was already this other authority in law.
Traditional bad trade policy, um, the process, there is a quasi judicial process, but it all takes place inside the Commerce Department. It takes place among people who work for the president. It kind of mimics something that would happen in a courtroom, but it doesn't actually happen in a courtroom, and it doesn't involve real judges. But IEPA I hadn't heard the acronym. That helps. IEPA apparently goes to this international trade court, which I'm ashamed to admit I had never heard of before, and which is a real court with real judges who are appointed for life and are not basically just Trump employees. They're not former. Sorry, that policy is unavoidable, but they're not former Fox News hosts or something like that, and they just suddenly came. It must have been in the works, but suddenly came down and said, "Hey, none of the reasons that you could be justified in invoking this thing actually apply here." Is that
Yeah, and I think that you're right when you say most people don't have to deal with this court because most of the time they're doing really boring stuff and small bore stuff. And I think this ruling came as a shock to me and a shock to a lot of other people because, like I said, I expected courts to be extremely deferential to the president on emergency powers as they have
yeah?
been in the past. And the fact that this is like the justifications were so bad that they weren't deferential anymore really tells you like what
By the way,
what
what
happened.
kind of things do they normally do? What if I had ever paid attention to the ITC before? Um, what what would be a typical? Can you give what would be a typical case on their docket?
I my understanding of this is very
Yeah.
limited because I'm I do econ not law, but my understanding is it's like much more narrow stuff about like the anti-dumping
Okay.
tariffs. So there's other authorities that like the U.S. government has to say, hey, we think Vietnam is dumping solar panels into the United States. We do an argument there.
By
We're
the way,
going to court. These are supposed
dumping
to
in this
be
parlance means selling below cost. It's There's another economics definition, but never mind. And we consider, instead of saying thank you for selling us stuff cheap, we say that's evil. That's unfair competition. But anyway, they would be handling things like that, like a claim that Vietnam was selling us some stuff below production cost, um, and then all of a sudden it's like the president's entire economic agenda is on their docket.
yes. That's my understanding is that most of the stuff they do is very small bore, and then suddenly they got like the biggest case you could possibly imagine.
Yeah. And one of the
Um,
strange things about it was, I mean, I thought it was weird, um, but sort of weird for the environment that um, we're declaring this emergency requiring drastic action in an economy that doesn't look like it's having an economic emergency. That must have. I didn't actually read all the way through the opinion, but right. I mean, we have still low unemployment. Inflation is still low. Give the tariffs a little while to work their way through. But I think that in effect, the report said, first of all, where's the emergency?
right, and the point of the so the second round of tariffs, like I said, the fentanyl stuff is like very ridiculous because it's not targeted towards the emergency. Obviously, fentanyl's a real thing, but like fentanyl was a real thing in 2023 and it was a real thing
Yeah.
in 2017, and tariffs are not going to affect that at all. And then secondarily, like the authority that they're trying to direct Trump to is saying if you have a balance of payments crisis, things are falling apart. This is what you can use. And as far as I'm aware, the only times that those things have been invoked was like Nixon trying to prevent balance of payment crisis in the 70s for very short periods of time, 2 to 3 months, when he was you know, facing what at the time was like actually genuinely historic shock to the U.S. economy from trade. Generally the deficit's been expanding,
Yeah.
but it's not like it shot up, except for the fact that people were front running these tariffs. Like if the tariffs weren't there, the deficit would be
Yeah.
lower.
So a balance of payments
So it's a
crisis
little
actually is a funny thing because traditionally a balance of payments crisis is that um, you're running out of foreign currency, running out of foreign exchange. Um, and it's not simply having a trade deficit because that can happen for all kinds of reasons. It's literally that you're in if you're uh, I don't know, Argentina in 1957, and you're trying to peg the peso to the dollar, and you're running out of dollars. That's a balance of payments crisis. The United States doesn't really. We uh, we're not trying to peg the dollar to anything. We don't actually hang on to foreign currency, so we don't even have. We almost sort of can't have a balance of payments crisis in the traditional sense. I'm not sure when the law was written what they had in mind, um, um, but we do have a trade deficit. But but that is not what would normally be considered something that, as long as foreigners are happy to invest in America and cover the trade deficit, where's the crisis?
Right. And I think the law is written with this intention of like when we had the international peg to the gold standard, and we were worried that the French are going to show up with a battleship in New York and ask for all of their gold back, and then we'd have like a real problem. That can't happen anymore. And obviously was not happening in March of this year to inspire this use of IEPA. Like I think the core thing here is there was no inciting incident in the months before, the way that most activations of IEP are supposed to work. There's a war, there's a natural disaster, there's a balance of payment crisis. You get emergency powers. The court here is like, where's the emergency? Where's the urgency here?
Actually, though I think actually the French battleship, aside from the fact I'm not sure that they have any, I think that actually kind of could happen because we do have a bunch of French gold, which is not in Fort Knox. It's actually in the basement of the New York Fed. So I guess the French could show up and say, "We want our gold from the basement." But yeah, that's not something that's going to be a real issue here. And Nixon basically did this to force countries to revalue their currencies against the dollar, and was short-lived. It had a very specific goal. Um, by the way, did you hear? I think you probably said something about it on social media about Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, about um, the dollar against other currencies. Said that.
Oh yeah, when he was like, the dollar isn't losing value, other currencies are
Yeah,
gaining value, and
that has got to be one of the classics. But anyway, so okay, so Trump comes in, um, invokes. Do you know what day he was when IEPA was actually invoked? What was was that just before?
February 4th was the day it was actually imposed. I don't remember the exact date the executive order was signed, but it was like
Okay,
February
so
1st.
sometime
So
very
very
early
early
on
on
he
in the
invoked
term.
this, but then really took advantage of it on Liberation Day on April 2nd with this vast array of tariffs on everybody, and all of it justified by the claim that there was an international economic emergency. Um, and then somehow, do we even know who brought suit with the was it self-generated or did somebody actually complain to the international?
So it's a
Oh,
coalition of
okay.
groups, and I'm gonna feel bad for excluding people who are not, I don't remember, but it's a coalition of states. So I believe California, Washington, Virginia, some states. It's a coalition of importers, so like people who paid tariffs and view that it's unfair. They have standing before the court, and then it's also um, a bunch of academics and maybe or policy
Okay.
advocacy groups. So the people at the Cato
Wow.
Institute, who are like very libertarian. There's like a law group that, again, I feel so bad that I'm
Right.
forgetting the name, attached to Cato, and they were the ones working on this. And so I think they feel very proud right now of the result. Um, I will say, so the maybe should have said some of this earlier, to temper expectations. I'm a little, I the Trump administration is going to appeal this. So my view is they have 10 days right as of right
Okay.
now to rescind the tariffs completely. Um, my view is that they're probably going to appeal this, and appeals court is going to say, you have longer than 10 days, and then it's going to go to the appeals court, and the appeals court is going to judge something like this. And they have, like we were discussing before, a lot of other authorities to raise
Right.
tariffs. If people remember, a few days after Liberation Day on April 9th, when Trump first paused the tariffs, like the stock market jumped, 7-8%. in the middle of the day when he paused it. And if you look at the stock market today, it's up like 1%. Stock market is not the economy, but I'm saying if people thought the tariffs are done, they're never coming back. There's no way that any of these are going to be as high as they were even a few days ago. The stock market would be up in the vein that it was April 9th and not like a middling but important amount. And so there's some sense of like, this is much more likely to get struck down. And they're going to have to go back and say, okay, we're going to use different powers that are more limited. We're going to have to take a lot of time to do a bunch of annoying homework. We're going to have to appeal this to higher courts. Um, but they're probably going to still impose a decent amount of tariffs. And by the way, the tariffs on cars, because those are Section
Right.
232, and the tariffs on steel and aluminum, those are all staying, and that's about 500 billion in imports a year. So that's like a big, that's bigger than the first term trade war by a decent margin. Um, and that's if this court ruling holds, and if they
So
do
yeah.
nothing else to restore those tariffs.
Wow. And then they probably, as I said, there can be more 232s. There are some more exotic numbers that I don't even know, that there are some other things they can invoke as well. So your guess is that they will, first of all, manage to stretch it out a bit and then claw back a fair bit. Um, but it's still a pretty amazing setback, and it has to have. Uh, I mean, it has to have an effect on um, trade negotiators from other countries, right? Anybody who was, yeah.
Oh yeah.
I mean, uh, kind of. Well, again, your version of what that does, because I'm trying to imagine it, but
So the initial tariffs and all of the revisions were under IEPA. So when we raised tariffs on China to 145%, and then we lowered them back down to 30%, that was all under IEPA. And some of these other authorities just don't give you that flexibility. The Section 301 tariffs on China, you have to, like I said, you have to do a ton of homework before you can activate the tariff authority. You have to say China is doing these unfair things and we're going to punish them for being unfair. And so you can't then credibly threaten, like, we're going to send tariffs to 190% tomorrow because we hate you, or we're going to drop them to 10% tomorrow because now we love you. um and in particular, so we're talking about the number soup again. If they use 122, the one that's universal, they have zero
122 is
flexibility.
the balance of
So the
payments,
one that the
right?
court Right. The one the court told them you should use this one. They would have zero flexibility because it has to be uniformly applied to all countries. So they couldn't then say, well, we're going to give you an exception because we like, Mexico and Canada have much lower tariffs right now. They couldn't go back and say, we're going to give Mexico and Canada the exception that we gave them on the IEPA tariffs because it's a different authority. There's other ones that are like totally untested. So I have written down Section 338 of the 1930 Trade
Good
Act.
God.
Where, so digging up like 100-year-old laws that have never been used before that plausibly could be used to recreate what they just did. But I think if the courts are saying, hey, this emergency power is not right, and then you go, well, I actually have another emergency power that does the exact same thing, I think they're going to be less sympathetic to that argument, because why would you have led with that power if it was the real one that had the legal authority? Um, and like I said, it's just as untested. IEPA, it's just as untested as IEPA stuff. So either like the Supreme Court is going to have to rule that yes, Trump does have this emergency authority under IEPA, or they're going to have to go do a ton of homework to do country specific, industry specific tariffs that give them a lot less flexibility in like negotiations than the tariffs they
And
currently
this
have.
means also that you're like the Prime Minister of Great Britain, um, thinking that, look, I'm going to flatter Trump and do something or other. I don't know. Britain's probably not the right example of this, but um, give him a used jet as a gift, in order to get lower tariffs. The problem is that now it's even if Trump can reconstruct a lot of the tariffs, he probably doesn't have the kind of discretion over tariff setting that he appeared to have 24 hours before we had this conversation.
Right, and that he would be located in much more limited industries. So if you're a country that, like, I think if you did a Section 232 investigation into copper, that's one of the ones
Yeah,
they're doing right now, it's plausible that a court is going to look at that and say, "Yeah, we need copper for electrical wires." These arguments that I think are wrong, but they don't have to be right in the eyes of the court. They have to be
right.
plausible. They give deference to the president again. They're not going to give deference to the president on, you know, very small agricultural tariffs, fish or whatever. So if you're a big agricultural exporter, and those are, a lot of countries, Trump loses a lot of ability to threaten you in the immediate short term, because it would be a lot harder to write a Section 232 investigation on, banana imports.
Yeah, that's actually one of the ones I was wondering because you've gone on. I'm particularly not all that fond of bananas, but there are other things. Um, this would be catastrophic if I lost it. The and Those are really really hard to justify under anything else other than NAIPA, right? So a lot of the sort of consumer goods that people can live without are not me in the case of coffee, but are actually probably not coming back.
I wouldn't say
Oh,
probably
okay.
yet. But like I said, if the appeals support this, then yes. I will say, like I said, when we had the conversation 2 weeks ago, I did not think this was a possibility, that any court was going to rule that he was using the emergency powers uh, um, unlawfully, even though I thought that was correct legal opinion. And I'm still skeptical that, like, appellate courts and the Supreme Court are going to agree with me and disagree with Donald Trump. But this is, like, a lot more faith in the courts than I had just a couple weeks ago. So that, for context on where I am right now.
Okay. So if you were a business person planning some international trade, what would you be doing right now?
Um, I have no idea, and this is the kind of core problem of these tariffs from the start. Tariffs are bad, but the worst part of a lot of this is how unmanageably complicated it is. I have a chart that I've been updating since the start of this year on every change to the tariffs. And I swear, if people go look at that chart, I'm like struggling to fit the text in because there's been so many changes. And if you're going back and saying, well, now all the tariffs previously are invalid, they still want to do tariffs. They're gonna do something, but I have even less idea of what that something is, because all of the information that I've seen thus far from the Trump team is invalid. Like, I don't know how you plan around that, and I do feel for people who are like, um, small businesses who have to import just a few things from China or Europe or Japan, and they're constantly stuck in this loop where the most important news of the day is like whatever Donald Trump says about tariffs, and not the other 99% of running a business that you have to focus on.
And now all of a sudden,
Um,
it's not just what Donald Trump happens to say. It's not just his whims, but it's also all of now it's the courts. So there's a whole new layer of
right,
uncertainty.
right, and for the record, obviously not blaming the courts, blaming the, like, incompetent
No.
legal proceedings from the Trump administration. But this is like, why previously in his first term there were more people who were, uh, for lack of a better term, serious
Yeah.
protectionists. They wanted to win a trade war with
Yeah.
China. They were constantly optimizing of how do we win a trade war with China, and I think that's, I think they didn't. I think they
No.
lost. So I think they were, that's the first place. I think also the idea of like winning a trade war is a bit of a wrong-headed way to think about trade. But they were like, from that perspective of we need to win a trade war with China, they were very strategic. We need to exclude smartphones because people will notice that. We need to include all of these key parts that go into automobiles because we don't want to be dependent on China for that. They came up with long lists and justifications, and they went to industry associations and they said, tell us, what your problems are. We're operating in China right now. And again, like I said, not successful, but at least was an intense effort, a lot of homework done on that issue. And the fact that the April 2nd tariffs were just a random number from a formula, and we put 50% tariffs on Madagascar and Lesotho, is emblematic of how not serious this is. And now the fact that the not seriousness is catching up to them in the courts, and nobody knows where it's going to end up, because the people who are let's make sure we have this on a good legal footing in 2018 are not in the administration anymore. So even at the base level, they don't have people working on this seriously.
Okay, and so maybe the best news about this whole thing is we're actually starting possibly to enter a regime in which not being serious about policy actually does carry some cost with it. Amazing. Um,
Here's hoping.
and it's definitely a Politano Full Employment Act, right? I mean, you're going to be kept busy on this stuff for quite a while. I've been kind of ready to move on,
The
but all right, here
policy
we
full
go.
employment. I if they it, as long I thought I was getting a reprieve. This has been so the longest that the administration has gone without a change in tariffs has been 1 month. That was between February 4th and March 4th, and they have not got a month since. And we were closing in on a record here. We had 3 weeks where nothing happened, and of course you can't have that. So we had the everyone's memory hold these things, by the way, but remember the 50% tariff on films? Nobody's talked about that in a month. Remember the 50% tariff on the European Union? Everybody's forgotten about that one, even though
That's
it's
still
still
slated to
slated
go
for
on July 9th, but maybe not.
July 9th. But no, there's never been an executive order. It's just tweets. So is that real? Is that not real? Are the courts going to agree with that one? I got no idea. Um, but yes, it does keep changing, and so I will take the Politano Free Employment Act
Okay.
of keeping up with the
Okay, well,
tariffs.
thanks for talking with me, and we'll consult again with the next major change in policy, probably about 6 hours from now.